Okay, so we're going to get into the Whitney Webb of it all. I've heard Ian Cale mention Whitney Webb and all of the work that she's been doing in terms of really digging into Epstein and his web and really just trying to figure out what is going on there. What are some theories that is at the root of everything happening with Epstein? Why was the case against him brought forward in 2019 and so on? And so I think that this is very relevant, especially since we had the Epstein victims or survivors come forward and do a press conference with Ro Khanna, Thomas Massie, with the bill that they put together to basically pass a law or potentially pass a law called the Epstein Transparency Act. And in that bill, they do have a bunch of stipulations or expectations regarding the Epstein files, because previously we were told, hey, we're going to release all of the files, and then that has not happened. What has been released is information that has already been available to the public, and so we haven't really gotten more information or a full picture of everything that happened in regards to Epstein, especially with what happened in terms of his victims, who are his clients, who were these women victimized by, and then also what happened with his death, why was it covered up, and all of that stuff. And so I haven't really wanted to talk about the press conference just because I was a little bit uncomfortable with it. I know that there were mixed reactions on social media. A lot of people are obviously supporting the victims, advocating for them, and then on one hand, people are saying, yes, these girls were victimized, but they participated and all of that stuff. And so it does become very messy when you look at it from all sides. But I do think that people who are victim of sexual abuse and human trafficking, they do deserve to be supported. At the same time, you can recognize how layered the conversation is and how messy it is, especially when you're dealing with people who are forced into things, who would do things that they normally would not do under normal circumstances. Okay, so to give an analogy or to bring books and movies into this, I do love to bring books and movies and entertainment into my videos just to help kind of flesh out my ideas and give you guys an idea of what I'm picturing. And so in 1923, we have this guy, Donald Whitfield, who is really powerful and he's financially secure, and he is just moving around town and trying to get the Dutton kind of like forced out of their business and all of that stuff. And so what was really weird about his role in 1923 is that he was very perverse and he was basically abusing women, and these women were prostitutes, and he was bringing them in to play out his weird fantasies. And I think at first he had two women. One of them was killed because of the activity that they were doing, and then the one girl who was left, she was expected to recruit somebody else because she didn't want to go through whatever pain he was going to put her through. And then she ended up becoming the abuser because she would abuse the other woman, thinking that she was above her, she had more power and all of that stuff. And so I think when it was the first set of two girls, one girl went really crazy thinking, hey, nothing's gonna happen to me. And then when the situation reversed, that girl who was initially abused, she took out all of the anger on that first girl for not really helping her and all of that stuff. And so that fits into everything with Epstein. So when you say, hey, these girls were victims, but they participated in it, that scene and those moments in 1923 are exactly what we're talking about. How you get roped into a situation, you're uncomfortable with it, and then when you find it out, possibly this is what you resort to, or this is what you turn into. And that's very sad and unfortunate, because a lot of these situations do come out of dire circumstances and wanting to better your life or wanting to do something crazy, thinking that it's just innocent fun, when it turns into something much more wild. And so I can obviously sympathize with women or any person who's a victim of that, and I can also understand the many layers to the conversation if we are looking at the full picture, and then also those tiny little details that also matter. Now, going back to the Epstein Transparency Act, so they did need 218 signatures to get this passed through and to get the next steps rolling. And I think about a week or so, they may have only needed 2 more votes when they did the press conference. And now I believe I saw something online on Twitter that said that they got the 218 votes that they needed. And there's also this clash with the White House and saying, hey, what you guys are doing, Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, you guys are undermining everything that the DOJ and the Oversight Committee is trying to do behind the scenes to actually get this more fully fleshed out. And then also people not wanting to kind of step on the toes of the White House and all of that stuff. But then you really have other people saying, hey, no, we don't need to protect powerful and rich people. We don't care who this upset. We need transparency. We need all of the files. We need the unredacted files and all of that stuff, with the exception of obviously protecting people's confident and personal information as far as the victim and all of that stuff. And so this is super messy and super layered. And then the other thing that I came across on social media was the comments from Speaker Johnson, and how he said that Trump was an FBI informant, so he was informing on Epstein and all that stuff. And so people have a lot of questions about what that exactly means, especially when you bring in the conversation around the Democratic hoax that Trump was saying that this was all about. And so is he saying the whole thing is made up, there's no victim, everything is irrelevant or whatever, or is he just saying the Democratic hoax is that they're saying that I'm much more involved in this as far as hurting the victims than I actually am? I'm not 100% sure, but let's go ahead and get into the Whitney Webb of it all. This is Hey Britney, welcome back. Okay, so Whitney Webb recently did an interview with Peter McCormack. Hopefully I'm saying his last name correctly. I haven't been able to find anything where he says his name, and I know that he's British and maybe they say it differently. So if I did say his last name wrong, please let me know in the comment section. So anyway, in this interview, they're really talking about the Epstein of it all and all of his different connections and how this ties into the world as we know it. And so throughout this interview, she does drop a lot of names. So a lot of them we already know, like Lex Wexner, Robert Maxwell, Bill Gates, Donald Trump. There's also a lot more names that she drops throughout this interview that I can't recall off the top of my head, but it was really crazy to see all of these different ties that he had, especially to people in government and also people who are the heads or part of in terms of really high up levels of big companies that we know of today. And it's just so crazy to see how intertwined everything is, because she was saying that she got a lot of flack for saying that everybody is complicit or involved in this Epstein scandal. And people, I guess, was trying to say like, hey, you know, this is just a way to say that you don't really know who is involved, if that makes sense. And so I can understand why people say that, but also how scary it is to know that there are so many people that are involved in this scandal, in this web, in this network that we don't know about. And throughout this interview, she talks about the way that this network functions is like organized crime. And if you think of organized crime, you think of like the mob, and you think of the mob, they may have like ties, they may be really powerful in one particular city or in one particular area, and kind of like outside of that area, you don't really know much about them, but you know of them. And so that's kind of like how this web is operating based on what she said in this interview. And I also know that she has 2 books that she's written. I have not read them yet, but they may be on my wish list of books to read. And so just getting back to the idea of the mob or organized crime, I don't really think about the mob in my day-to-day life. I don't really think of them as having an impact on what I do in my day-to-day, but this is really weird when you think about what she's saying, because, for example, she brought up how there's a guy, Beator, I believe, who got some position with United Colors of Bennington, and I know of this store, and I think they had some type of controversial scandal in the early 2000s. I can't recall all of the details of that, but that's a clothing store that was really popular. And when you go to these companies or these stores or these businesses and you buy their products, you're not always thinking about who funded the company and why, or who is part of their board, or who has a position within the company. You're not really thinking that high up unless you're someone who's like more socially aware and actually cares about these types of things. And so that's what's really fascinating to me, because she talked about how Epstein had connections with like people in Facebook, Google, and all of that stuff. And so when you think about how widespread that is, it is really problematic, because yes, you should assume that everybody knows everybody, but I think when it comes to the celebrity world, we're also kind of, even though this is shocking, we're used to people saying, oh, I don't know if so-and-so, like how Mariah Carey pretends like she doesn't know some of these people, or she's not up to date on news. I think it's very easy to think of these people, because they have separate businesses, that they don't really know each other, when in reality, they are more likely to know of each other because of their status levels, because of their businesses, and who else they know within their network and their circle of friends. Now, let's talk about the interview. So I did see a lot of comments where people were talking about the style of the interview, and they were talking about how Whitney Webb was dressed and how she resembled Velma from Scooby-Doo. And at first, I noticed something with like her yellow sweater and then her headband and the glasses. I didn't really think of it, but when I read that comment, it made so much sense, and she absolutely looks like Velma in this interview. But in terms of the general vibes of this interview, people were talking about how impressive it is that she did this whole interview with no laptop, with no notes. So all of it is from memory. All of it is her talking about all of this stuff that she's researched, and how she's able to remember everything and kind of have a really good flow to the interview, to where it doesn't seem like she's spending a lot of time trying to remember things or think about it for a long period of time in order to talk about it. And I imagine she's done a bunch of interviews where she's had to talk about this a lot, and so it's easy for her to fall back on that information that she has. But it is really cool to see someone get in front of a camera, talk to someone else, and be able to pull these things out and share new information or phrase things in a way that keep you engaged throughout the interview. Now, let's talk about why she says Epstein might have gotten caught. And she talks about how she doesn't think that this was because the government or people in power felt like, hey, we need to avenge the victims, we need to do right by them, so let's hold Epstein accountable. She really thinks that it's because this method or this mode of blackmail has become irrelevant. And what she means by this is that there is this blackmail operation where young women are used to kind of get men in compromising positions, and then you can blackmail them with that information, especially if they don't want it to get out. And so she's basically saying that this method is outdated in a sense because technology has improved to where there's cameras everywhere. Everyone has a technological device that they use, and it's easy to plant stuff. It's easy to hijack your devices and all of that stuff. It's easy to just see what you're doing and monitor you, so you don't have to rely on someone like Epstein to create or manufacture that evidence that you need, that blackmail that you need in person, by actually building these relationships with these people. Now, obviously, if you're trying to plant stuff, maybe you need to get access to them physically to plant devices and all of that stuff. So you do need a middle person to kind of form that relationship and so on. But for the most part, she's saying that this type of blackmail, this mode of blackmail, is not really relevant anymore. And so this kind of leaves them exposed, especially with how high profile this case became. And then also all of his different connections and who else would be kind of brought into the spotlight if Epstein himself is exposed and all of the details are forced to come out. And I thought it was really fascinating how she brought up how Epstein, in terms of how he was able to get all of these different positions and have these different networking opportunities, she talked about how she didn't think that he was a stupid person who didn't know anything about finances. She really thought that people were hiring him because they thought that he was financially savvy. And I think they talked about how he was able to find hidden money and basically make people rich and all of that stuff, or richer than they already were, by finding some loophole and hidden money and all of that stuff. So I would love to dig into that more. She also talked about how Epstein was related or connected to the 2008 housing financial crisis, and she talked about how basically wealth from the 99% of population was transferred to the 1%. And I believe Ian Carroll is also doing a series or a few episodes talking about this, and so I do plan to watch his content on this as well, just to get more information. Okay, so this is where we get into the rest of the interview, where she's name dropping different people and talking about the different connections. She brings up Saudi Arabia, and she talks about MBS, who is the crown prince, and she talks about how basically Epstein stepped on the toes of John Brennan because John Brennan was in charge of the CIA, or he was the head of the CIA, and he was connected to someone who was previously in power in Saudi Arabia. And so when that person was no longer in power because they were killed, they died, that sort of thing, and this new person, MBS, is now in power, he felt like Epstein stepped on his toes. And I think that's why she's saying that this 2019 case against Epstein was really brought forth because he kind of had so many connections, but also because he was involved in so many things, he eventually stepped on someone's toes, is how I would phrase it. And the really crazy part of this interview was the whole conversation around transhumanism. Basically, she's talking about Saudi Arabia and their 2030 plan, and she's talking about how this is a plan for post-oil Saudi Arabia, but then she's also talking about robotics and how Sophia the robot, I didn't look into this too much, but she's basically saying this is a robot who was the first robot to get citizenship, and that's really crazy when you think about it. Like, you don't think of robots as getting citizenship. Like, I saw a story recently where a lady pretended like her dog was human and she voted under the dog's name and that sort of thing. So that sounds weird because we don't even give dogs citizenship, and now we're talking about giving robots citizenship. And so that was pretty crazy. That was really wild. But she's really bringing up this issue of how we have one, transhumanism, so basically mixing humans with technology to surpass biological limitations of being human. And you can best think of it as like the Terminator and how he's kind of like part machine, part human. And that's really crazy, and that's really wild if that's what we're moving towards. And I know that people have been talking about this in terms of different things, but that still blows my mind that that could be a reality one day, where we have people who are part human and part robot in the real world. That's not something that we're just seeing in movies. And the other part of what she brought up was how this was transnational. So she's basically saying that all of these different countries are intertwined when it comes to the Epstein network, and this is why the network has so much reach and why it's above law and order, why people are not held accountable for certain crimes, because they've been able to connect all of these different countries, but they've also been able to capture and hijack the different institutions that would hold these people accountable. Moving on, she also talked about how instrumental the modeling industry was in all of this that is happening in terms of making connections between different people and different countries. And I thought that this was fascinating because I think most girls, they aspire, even if it's just like in passing or not something that they're really serious about, they want to be a model. And so when you think about how accessible modeling is to young girls, like I modeled when I was younger, and I can't even imagine what would have happened if I continued modeling. And especially when you talk about how these women, they were wanting to advance their careers, they got exposed to these people who then introduced them to other people, and that sometimes led to dark paths. But then she was also talking about how for some of these women that Epstein came across, he was able to introduce them to rich and powerful people and kind of help them get married off. So in a sense, it's kind of like this mail order bride type of situation. And for some women, that was what their fate ended up being. And for other women, they were used for blackmail purposes. And then other women really got the bad end of a stick, where they were victims of abuse and exploited and all of that stuff. And so that is really sad when you think about how something like the modeling industry, where you can kind of see its influence everywhere. These are the people who are modeling in the magazine ads we see, they're modeling on TV and all of that stuff. And I don't think that people realize how influential or how everywhere modeling is. I watched The Real Housewives, and a lot of women who were on those shows, they had young daughters who became supermodels. So we're talking about Bella Hadid, and then the other girl, Gigi Hadid. So the other sister, Gigi Hadid, and then we have Kendall Jenner from the Kardashians, and there's one more person that I'm not thinking of who is part of that group. But when you think of modeling, that's what you think. You think of these people who become supermodels, they become super famous, and all they're doing is just wearing clothes or modeling and all of that stuff. You don't really think about the dark side of modeling. And I think one story that you can point to is the story of the, I think, first supermodel, which is Gia. She does have a movie about her that Angelina Jolie played Gia in that movie, and it's really crazy when you look into her story and you see what these women go through in terms of just being able to model the clothes and all of that stuff, especially with everything in connection to Epstein and how the modeling industry is kind of like the foundation of a blackmail ring, and it's used to trap other people into positions where you can take advantage of them. Lastly, I want to talk about the idea of centralized power, and she's really talking about how within this network, this organized crime of people who are basically in positions of power, there's this effort to consolidate that power and remove the competition. And she points to Peter Thiel and how he basically said, competition in the free market is for losers, just have a monopoly. And so we've been talking about, in the videos that I've come across, they've been talking about monopolies, and I think they talked about that in the capitalism debate from Jubilee with PBD. There's certain businesses like Amazon, for example, that has a monopoly on e-commerce. And so with Peter Thiel, she was talking about his surveillance program, and it was really crazy because she was talking about how he had this surveillance program, and eventually what that can lead to is being able to predict whether or not people will do something. And so that's crazy to think about, people being held accountable for things that they haven't done, but what they are predicted to do. And that's really crazy because we are obviously a society where if we know, hey, you're planning to commit some horrible crime and we know about your plans in advance, maybe we'll arrest you, that sort of thing. And then for the most part, we arrest people after they commit crimes. So it's really wild and crazy that you can go after people because you think they may do something. So that's really weird. And it's really weird in that sense because it's an algorithm predicting what you do versus physical evidence that you're planning something, is how I perceive it. And so that is just really wild to me. And then she talks about how because we are economically dependent on the government, in terms of how we live our lives, we use cash to buy things, we need access to money in order to buy products, the things that we need to pay our bills and all of that stuff. And so if they were to remove cash and move us to a digital currency, they are more able to track what we are spending our money on, and they can control the population that way. And she says that the way to get around this is not to be economically dependent on the government, on whatever the status quo is, because once it gets to a certain point where you don't have the freedom that you have now with money and finances, it's going to get even more dire. And that was really crazy because I'm someone who loves using my phone to pay for things. I really don't carry cash anymore. And so I understand the implications of what she's saying, but I can also see how I'm headed in that direction anyway. And it's crazy to me because for me, it's just a matter of convenience. It's not me really thinking about losing access to money, because if I need to go to the ATM, I want to be able to take out money. I can't imagine that not being an option because everything is digitized. And it's crazy to me to be able to log into your account and just see numbers on the screen. And it's kind of like when you're playing video games and you see the money in your bank account. Obviously, it's not real money. It's kind of like that. And that is getting into that conversation of how they say that money isn't really real. It's like a man-made thing. And I can absolutely see what they're saying when they say that. And that also ties into the capitalism debate with PBD, and how basically people are saying, you shouldn't have to work so many jobs to survive, and every being on earth, they have to put in some effort in order to take care of themselves to survive. Animals don't have to deal with money, right? They just need to hunt, they need to find shelter and all of that stuff. Humans, we've complicated things by bringing feelings, bringing intelligence, bringing in money and all of that stuff in order to live, in order to survive. And all of that overcomplicatedness is what makes living as a human so difficult, because imagine how much more simple your life would be if all you had to do was worry about how to find food, how to find shelter, and obviously protect yourself from danger, and you're not having to worry about all of these superficial decisions. Because, for example, I always wear a black shirt in my videos, and the reason I do it is because of the Steve Jobs of it all. And so obviously Steve Jobs is doing way more than I'm doing, but he had so many decisions to make that he wanted one less decision, which was to wear the same thing every day, so he doesn't have to think about what he's wearing each day. He can focus on the things that matter. And so I think that we as humans, we have overcomplicated what it means to be human and to be alive, and how to survive and coexist in this world with other species, with animals and all of that stuff. We've elevated ourselves to being so much better than animals because we can do X, Y, and Z, that we don't realize that we've also made things very difficult for almost no reason, in a sense. Because yes, technology has done wonders for civilization, but at the same time, how different would our lives be if we never had the internet, if we never had technology, and all we had was cash or whatever bartering system that we had to trade goods to get our needs met on a day-to-day basis. Alrighty, so to wrap up this video, that was everything that I wanted to cover on this Whitney Webb interview that she did with Peter McCormack. And so I thought there was a lot of good information that she brought out here, and that she kind of put together all of the pieces, at least as far as what she was able to do in this interview, without kind of not preventing people from wanting to read her book, if she gives away all of her secrets and stuff like that. But this was definitely a good interview, and I'm looking forward to finding more interviews of her so that I can see if there's anything else that she reveals in those interviews. And then I do at some point plan to read her 2 books and see what information I find there. So yeah, let me know what you think about this interview between Whitney Webb and Peter McCormack. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.